Welcome to Believing the Word with author and pastor Dan Shunk. This program is a ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
Have you ever noticed those tendencies to think, I have earned this, or the person that says, I'm going to just pull myself up by my bootstraps. That's what that is pride. And Egypt looked at themselves as not just the creator of their own prosperity, but they were the sustainer of it, and they were the reason that they gained prosperity for themselves. Now, as believers, we don't think that. As believers, we think, well, listen, any prosperity I get, it's because I can now use that for God's kingdom.
How often do we consider the idea that our pride can falsely elevate us to the God of our own lives? Yet, are we sovereign? Today in Ezekiel, chapters 29 through 32, God confronts Egypt's pride and defiance. Pharaoh believed he was God. He thought his power, wealth, and influence made him untouchable. But God reminds the nations that no kingdom can stand against him. Through images of broken strength and coming judgment, Ezekiel shows that Egypt's real problem was spiritual rebellion rooted in pride. The message is simple and sobering. When pride defines a nation or a person, downfall follows. But God alone remains sovereign over all. Now here's Pastor Dan in the book of Ezekiel as he continues his message, Defining Egypt's Defiance.
Join me in Ezekiel chapter 29. We're going to pick up where we left off in our study because that's what we do. And we're going to keep going. This is actually the very last message in the first three sections of Ezekiel. We're now transitioning after tonight into the future prophecy part of the book. So just a little recap to remember kind of where we're at here as we pick up in chapter 29. The first three chapters were Ezekiel's commission. This was the Lord calling him to this work in Babylon to preach to not just Israel back in Jerusalem and Judea, but also to the Jews that were there in Babylon. And then he wrote for 21 chapters, messages to his Jewish nation. And then we transitioned in the last couple of weeks into this third section where he was told also to write letters against these foreign nations. And it wasn't just random foreign nations. It was all the nations that were directly, not just around Israel, but the ones that directly impacted Israel. Just remember that. That's the reason why we have this section of these 7 or 8 chapters that are directed at these foreign nations, because they impacted Israel. Do you remember what the Lord said in Matthew 25 as he's talking about his second coming? And when he comes back, he will reward or not people that blessed Israel or not. Those that did this in my, they say, Lord, when did we see you naked or poor or give you a drink? And he's like, when you did it to one of these, my brethren, you did it unto me. And so there's always a reward or a loss of reward for how you treat Israel. And that's why these nations are listed here in this section. Well, we're finishing up that section about foreign nations tonight. I find this fascinating. I mean, tonight particularly, these 4 chapters to finish up this section in chapter 29 through 32, he's addressing the nation of Egypt. This is one of the most powerful nations that's ever walked the face of the earth. And here's this prophet from this tiny little place called Judah that's prophesying to the Pharaoh, saying things like, yeah, you're toast, and I just get a kick out of that when you really, we read it from the perspective of Christians as biblical text that it's already come to pass thousands of years ago, all of these prophecies of how things were going to lay out. But at the time he wrote this was this tiny little prophet from this tiny little nation who's sitting in exile himself, writing to one of the most powerful men on the earth, yeah, the Lord's coming after you. I find that amazing. I mean, it took great faith just to write that if you're Ezekiel. And so this is the final look at these foreign nations, and we're going to look at Egypt tonight in these 4 chapters. I almost split these 4 into 2, but that would have been 2 kind of short messages. So we're going to put this into one message about Egypt and get it out of the way. And then we're going to be moving on to chapter 33 the next time we're together. And this begins this future prophecy section of the book of Ezekiel. Chapter 33 through 39 is an amazing chronological section. You begin to read those chapters. For those 7 chapters, you begin to see everything that the Lord's been doing in bringing Israel back into the land in the 19th century, or the 20th century, that is, in the 1900s. Everything from the land becoming fruitful again, to raising up shepherds to guide them, to the nation becoming one again. All of that is chronologically, step by step in chapters 33 through 39. And so, of course, 38 and 39 is that famous battle of Gog and Magog. And we'll get to that. And that will be, maybe that'll actually happen in real life before we actually get to those chapters. That's how close we are. And so then after that, there's 9 chapters talking about the millennial kingdom to finish up the book. But those chapters will go rather quickly. We'll take the whole thing in probably 3 sessions because some of it is literally a blueprint. You ever looked at a blueprint, right? You don't pick up a blueprint and read it from top to bottom, left to right. You pick up a blueprint to use it for what you want to use it for. So much of those 9 chapters is the layout of the land of Israel during the millennial kingdom and things like that. So we don't have to read every stitch of those last 9 chapters to finish out the book. So here we are in chapter 29, and we're looking at the nation of Egypt. Now, this is in the time when Babylon was the world ruling empire. Remember that. So Egypt, although very, very powerful, they're not ruling like they used to. In the days of Joseph and Moses, Egypt was really the dominating force in the world. At this point, though, in the 600s BC, Babylon is really the dominant power, and there's other powers like the Pharaoh in Egypt that have their own independence from Babylon and are very strong themselves. So, man is born with a fleshly will that is against God. And that's the choice. We can either continue in self-will, like we'll see with Pharaoh today, and be condemned, or we can convert and believe what God says is true. And that's the choice. And so much of what we're going to read here that's addressed to not just Egypt, but to their leader, the Pharaoh, presents that and says, listen, you had a choice, and this is what you chose. In a very simple way, condemnation is a result of our own doings. It's not the Lord that has to come up with some unique punishment. It's the natural thing for our sinful actions to gain these kinds of results. So we'll see that as we go through. So we're gonna take 4 steps through defining Egypt's defiance towards their creator. Even there, that's that's what gives Ezekiel the privilege to write to this great Pharaoh, is that they're a child of God just like he is. They're a created. Pharaoh is a created man just like Ezekiel is a created man. They both fall under God. And the Lord said, write this letter to Pharaoh. And so we're going to see this interaction here with what Ezekiel has to say to him tonight. So you may notice some of these tendencies as he's addressing Pharaoh in our character traits within our own lives tonight that we need to work out. So always make sure you take the scripture with that approach also. There's a surface text here where Ezekiel is writing to this Pharaoh, but it's included, these particular stories are included in God's eternal word because he knows we need to grow from these. We need to learn from these. In another place in the scripture, it says, look, if all the things were written that Jesus did when he was here, there wouldn't be enough books to contain it. That as much as there could have been communicated of what he would want to tell us. But these particular stories, handpicked, because these are the ones that we can learn from. So not only is this a story of Ezekiel prophesying to the Pharaoh, the Lord said, no, Ezekiel, put this one in the book because all people for all time are going to need this one. Write it down. So don't ever lose track of that. That is an intended application of these accounts of history, is to take it into your own heart and say, am I doing these things? Am I doing what Pharaoh did or what other Egyptians did? So don't ever forget to take it in that way. So chapter 29, we're going to open this up by defining the problem. Defining the problem with Egypt. That is pride. Pride in thinking that they are the source and the sustainer and the very object of their prosperity. Have you ever noticed those tendencies? To think, I have earned this, Or the person that says, I'm going to just pull myself up by my bootstraps. That's what that is pride. And Egypt looked at themselves as not just the creator of their own prosperity, but they were the sustainer of it. And they were the reason that they gained prosperity for themselves. Now, as believers, we don't think that. As believers, we think, well, listen, any prosperity I get, it's because I can now use that for God's kingdom. Sure, I can fulfill my necessities with the Lord's provision in my life, but it's also primarily to build his kingdom. And yet Egypt is a classic example of seeing this great prosperity that they had and just thinking, this is for us. That's why I'm prospering, for my own benefit. And so we begin here in chapter 29, finally, verse 1. And it says, in the 10th year, in the 10th month, on the 12th of the month, the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and prophesy against him and against all of Egypt. Judah didn't fall until the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign. And this dating right here in verse 1 is in the 10th year. So this is just a few months before Babylon would come into Jerusalem for the final time and conquer that. So you got to remember, at this time, there's many Jews still in Israel and Judah that are still hoping that Egypt is going to come and deliver them from the Babylonians. They're still leaning on Egypt. They're still hoping that Egypt is going to be their source of help through all of this. What's been happening? The Lord's been saying, no, stop trusting in people. Ask me, right? I always get a kick out of it that every time, a tragedy comes up, do we first think, oh, well, let me ask God what I should do? Or do we first go to our checkbook? Or do we first go to somebody else to bail us out? What do we lean on first? And so here we find that many Jews in this time are still trying to rely on Egypt to bail them out from this Babylonian threat. And here it is right on the verge of Judah's fall. And many in Israel are still relying on Egypt to help. I mean, in modern terms, they'd call that trauma bonding. There's been so much interaction between Egypt and Israel over the years. Egypt was their original captors. I think there's a little Stockholm syndrome going on here too, if you know anything about that. And so Israel, that is, constantly turning back to Egypt to help them, of all people, the ones where they were enslaved for so long. And so they kind of acted under the premise that the enemy I know is better than the enemy I don't know. Well, we'll trust Egypt because at least we know what they're all about, when they're bad actors too. And so this is just an amazing thing that this prophet from this tiny country is prophesying against Pharaoh. God says to him, why don't you prophesy against, just the second most powerful person in the world right now? Amazing, amazing scenery. Verse 3, speak and say, thus saith Lord Yahweh, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great monster that lies in the midst of the canals of the Nile. You might have the translation of dragon. The Lord is comparing Pharaoh to, the word is tanium in the language, in the Hebrew. It's dragon or monster. Sea monster is the idea. He's just making a comparison. Of course, the Nile River was the great resource that Egypt always looked to as their sustenance. And that's how verse 3 finishes. You have said, my Nile is mine, and I myself have made it. What an amazing problem that they had. Pride can blind you to things that you don't even see. They've been in this land for these thousands of years, and they just act like, well, they're there so long. They possessed the Nile for so long. They act like they're the ones who made it. What a shame that they no longer give credit for the very basics of their surroundings to God, but they act as if they're the ones that have invented all of this. So there are really two major sins altogether listed there in verse 3. Number one is believing that they're the source of bringing all good things into their life, but also number two, believing that these resources are intended for them. What a shame. I have made this Nile is mine. I have made it. It is for me. Is that the way you view the possessions well, I earned it. It's mine. Well, how did you earn it? Well, I worked for it. You mean you worked with your body? Who gave you your body? Who gave you the ability to work? The Lord himself, right? And so he's trying to draw this all back to get rid of this pride. By the way, I want to point this out before we go on, because he's going to use this picture of Egypt and Pharaoh specifically as this sea monster or dragon of the Nile. This imagery is going to constantly be drawn out. Egypt had many false gods that they worshipped. And one of them, of course, even was the crocodile. And he's showing how God is going to show how they are all subservient to God himself. He already tried this, right? Back with the plagues under Moses' day. You might remember all of the plagues, all of the first plagues until we got up to the darkness. And then Even the darkness was a condemnation of their sun god Ra. And then it got to the killing of the firstborn because they believed in that dynasty, that the next son would be the Pharaoh, which is the god, and all of these things. All of those plagues in the days of Moses were even to come against their gods. That's the same thing that God has to do to them here. He hasn't broken them yet of this belief that they are God themselves. We're going to get to this more in a couple of weeks and actually on our Resurrection Sunday message. But that is a fundamental difference between what this world will teach you and what the Lord will teach you. Is the world will teach you we're here to ascend. We're here to rise up. Did God tell you not to eat that? He knows when you eat that, you will know the difference between good and evil, and you will be like God. Right? Where did that come from? The Garden of Eden, right? This is the lie of the devil from the beginning. And people like Egypt have bought into this lie, that we have done this for ourselves. We are here to ascend and to take possession for ourselves. What a lie. They bought the lie of the devil. Verse 4, the Lord says, I will put hooks in your jaws. Just continuing this imagery that they're a sea monster. And I will make the fish of your canals of the Nile cling to your scales. And so in the imagery here, we're talking about how all of Egypt will fall under this, like the catching of the fish. All Egypt will be caught by God is the idea. And I will bring you up out of the midst of your canals of the Nile, and all the fish of your canals of the Nile will cling to your scales. Verse 5, and I will abandon you in the wilderness, you and all the fish of your canals of the Nile. You will fall on the open field. You will not be brought together nor gathered. I have given you for food to the beasts of the earth and to the birds of the sky. So the picture of God as a mighty hunter, and God's going to draw out this sea monster, catching him on the hook and drawing him out. Kind of the idea of drawing him out away from home into the wilderness, as if you catch a fish and you just throw it out onto the land, right? And that's the idea. Except what is he really talking about here? We know that the downfall of this particular Pharaoh in these days of Ezekiel is when Babylon comes to attack them. Babylon draws them out of Egypt and decimates them out of their own land. And so this prophecy very, very literally fulfilled. The interesting thing here is that Egypt was meticulous about their burial. I mean, even today, we find Egyptian sarcophaguses and mummies, very meticulously wrapped and prepared for the dead because they believed in certain different principles of the afterlife. And here, what an insult that God's going to tell them, no, you're going to be pulled out by Babylon and just die in the field. That's the way this is going to go down. That is your punishment. God's even disrespecting their false beliefs of the afterlife, even in the way they're going to die. It's just showing his dominance, his superiority over all of their false beliefs. So that's kind of the idea here. Verse 6, then all of the inhabitants of Egypt will know that I am Yahweh. Emphasize the word I when you read that sometimes. The idea is to say, the God's not the crocodile, the God's not the sun, the God's not the Pharaoh, and all these other things. Then they will know that I am Yahweh. I am God when I show my dominance over all of these things. Just continuing verse 6, because they have been only a staff made of reed to the house of Israel. In verse 7, when they seized you with the hand, you tore and split open all their shoulders. And when they leaned on you, you broke and made all their loins quake. The idea is Israel tried to have Egypt help them. But when Egypt tried to metaphorically lean on Egypt, like a reed, like a rod, it pierced through their hand. It wasn't any good. Egypt was like a staff easily broken. Egypt was not a reliable friend, not a reliable helper, is the idea of what he's saying. So Judah tried to lean on them for help, but God says, you're going to be like a little broken up bamboo stick that just breaks. It's not going to be helpful. And so God will remove that thought from Israel. This thought that, well, maybe we should just turn to Egypt. And Israel sooner or later will realize that's not going to help. And that's God's intention here, to get them to rely on him. And then verse 8 here. Verse 8, therefore, thus saith Lord Yahweh, behold, I will bring upon you a sword, and I will cut off from you man and beast. The land of Egypt will become like a desolation and a waste. Then they will know that I am Yahweh, because you said the Nile is mine, and I have made it. Therefore, in verse 10, Behold, I am against you and against your canals of the Nile, and I will make the land of Egypt an utter waste and a desolation. In some translations, it says from Migdol to Syene. Maybe you have from the Tower of Syene. Migdol, that's what the town of Migdol means. The word means tower. Okay, so he's basically describing all over the land is the idea. And even over to the border of Ethiopia. And then verse 11, a man's foot will not pass through it, and the foot of a beast will not pass through it, and it will not be inhabited for 40 years. Verse 12, so I will make the land of Egypt a desolation in the midst of the desolated lands, and her cities in the midst of cities that are laid waste will be desolate for 40 years. And I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them among the land. So Egypt thought they were the source and the sustainer and just the object of all of their prosperity. And the Lord says, no, that's exactly why this punishment is coming. Because you thought you were all that, a bag of chips. You gave me no glory, no credit for any of this. And so God will remove that thought by their destruction. That is the idea. The entire land will be desolate and wiped out. Be sure, Egypt was the type of nation that it wasn't just them. Egypt's strength was in the fact that they had Libya and Ethiopia and all of these surrounding nations as a confederacy over all of these years. And so when it reads like, I will decimate you the whole way down to Ethiopia, that's why. That's why that whole area was confederate under the banner of Egypt themselves. And so just verse 13, we continue. For thus saith Lord Yahweh, at the end of the 40 years, I will gather the Egyptians from the peoples among whom they were scattered. I will return the fortunes of Egypt and make them return to the land of Paphros, which again is one of the cities of Egypt, and to the land of their origin, and there they will be a lowly kingdom. For in verse 15, it will be the lowest of the kingdoms. It will never again lift itself up above the nations. Then I will make them so small that they will not have dominion over the nations, and it will never again be the security for the house of Israel, bringing to remembrance the iniquity of their having turned to go after Egypt. Then they will know that I am Yahweh. So though Egypt will be restored, and certainly they were in the days of the Greeks specifically, Egypt was brought back to a certain measure of prosperity, but they were never again, after this time, brought to that place of being a leader of anything. I mean, even in the modern days, Egypt is a nation that's generally at peace with Israel, and with many of the Arab nations. They're just a nation of not much significance. For as much natural power as they should be able to have, what gives a nation the ability to have some natural influence in the world? Natural resources, waters, minerals, things like that. They have so much oil and all types of carbon, natural gas in the Mediterranean, and then the water of the Nile and the minerals that flow down the Nile. They have so much natural resource. They should be one of the dominating powers in this world today. Why aren't they? Because God put them in their place, and they've never again risen to anything of significance. And that is exactly what this shows. But it's by God's grace that he promises this heathen nation, though, that they will at least be restored and that they won't have a full end. There are other nations we've read about recently, including Edom and others, that God said, I'm going to be through with you. We're done here. And that is not the case with Egypt. In fact, you may remember, we're going to see them coming up in the book of Zechariah, being prophesied as being there during the 1,000-year millennial kingdom and their interaction with Israel in the kingdom to come. So there's more to come with Egypt in our future prophecy. We'll get to all that as we continue studying. So let's go to verse 17. Now, notice the shift here in verse 17. It actually goes to this is an entirely new prophecy. It's a whole new date. It's another prophecy altogether. If you went back to verse 1, you'd notice that all that we just read was given to Ezekiel in the 10th year, 10th month, okay, which was immediately before Jerusalem was conquered. Well, now, beginning in verse 17, notice the timing is the 27th year in the first month on the first of the month, the word of Yahweh came to me saying, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made his military force labor hard against Tyre, the nation of Tyre, north of Israel. Every head was made bald and every shoulder was rubbed bare, but he and his military force had no wages from Tyre for the labor that they had labored against it. Let me just pause it. We've had a little bit of a break here from when we talked about Tyre.
You've been listening to Believing the Word, a ministry of author and pastor Dan Shunk at Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Dan has been teaching through a series in the book of Ezekiel. We'd love to get connected with you and hear about how God is working in your life through this teaching program. You can reach us by phone at 717-500-1102. Again, that number is 717-500-1102. You can also check us out at our website at ccchambersburg.org, where you can learn more about the ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg and find our chapter-by-chapter messages. If you're in the Chambersburg area, we'd love to have you join us Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings on 5121 Coffee Avenue. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with more from the book of Ezekiel. But until then, this has been Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.